Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and I have been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we are continuing to march forward through yet another season together. As always, you can always find our 24/7, 100% free, boots on the ground Jacksonville Jaguars coverage when you follow us at Jaguars on SI on social media such as Facebook and Twitter. You can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. I am John Shipley. Today we are talking about the surprising release of Jaguars veteran safety Darnell Savage. A lot of different moving pieces with this one, in my opinion. Savage was somebody who, when this new staff came in, leading through the offseason program and up until the start of training camp, I thought Savage was going to have a legitimately large role in the defense. I thought he would be the starting safety across from Eric Murray. To me, it made a lot of sense. Eric Murray's a really physical, sound tackler. Maybe isn't the rangiest guy. Whereas Savage, very explosive athlete, lots of range, great ball skills, can cover like a corner. From really the start of training camp, though, it just seemed like the Jaguars had different plans for the safety room. I mean, right out the gate, the Jaguars, had a three-man competition for the safety spot opposite Murray between Savage, Andrew Wingard, and, of course, Antonio Johnson. But that didn't even really last long. That lasted for, I'd say, probably about the first 2 weeks of camp. After that, it became clear that, Andrew Wingard was the guy the Jaguars were rolling with opposite Murray. Wingard is a guy who has worked hard, for a lot of years since joining the franchise. Somebody who ultimately has really fought to kind of find a starting role in the defense. Somebody who has kind of played all kinds of roles, from being a starting safety in the past, being a third safety, being a core special teamer. He's kind of done it all with the Jaguars. And to his credit, he's had a strong first 2 weeks of the season. Had a really nice play for an interception against the Bengals. Would have had a pick six against the Panthers were it not for a holding penalty. Has made some nice run stops. Really, the only negative play I can think of is on the T. Higgins touchdown. So, for me, it seemed like the Jaguars, placed more of a premium on the safety position in terms of they wanted experienced guys who, and this is just my opinion, experienced guys who they knew at the end of the day would be where they're supposed to be. Is it the most dynamic safety room in terms of athleticism? Maybe not. But Eric Murray and Andrew Wingard are two guys who ultimately aren't going to freelance. Two guys who, that was the big issue in the safety room last year, when it came to Andre Cisco and Antonio Johnson. Just blown coverages, miscommunications. And Murray and Wingard will give you the opposite of that. They will communicate. They will essentially do the play call, do what they're tasked to do. Now, when it comes to Savage, to me, the Jaguars just kind of bungled him since they got him. And he was one of those guys who was kind of in a peculiar situation because, he was brought in by the prior regime. The new regime more or less inherited his contract. They parted ways with a lot of the guys that the last regime added last offseason. But it was clear they saw some value in him. He's played dime safety for them. I believe 48 snaps over the last 2 weeks. Somebody who, to me, still had something to offer to the team, even if you don't have him in the starting role. But in 2024, they sign him after 5 years with the Green Bay Packers, and the entire goal was for him to be a starting nickel corner. I know he had played safety in Green Bay, but they envisioned him as their starting nickel. A guy who would fit against a run, could be used as a blitzer, but more importantly, would be a dynamic guy in coverage. And he really was. He had a great start to his Jaguars tenure as the nickel. He flew everywhere. But the Jaguars poorly built the secondary around him. They add Jarian Jones in the third round last year as the nickel corner. And obviously Darnell, was starting above him. But from the moment they drafted Jarian, it seemed like a bit of a logjam at nickel. And then after a couple of games, they moved Darnell from nickel, where, he was designed to play, where he was thriving, where it just seemed like he fit best, back to safety. Because they were having issues with both Andre Sisco and Antonio Johnson in terms of blown coverages, miscommunications. And because of how they built the safety room last year, they had to take a guy out of position. And the entire reason he signed in Jacksonville, really, it seemed like, was to be able to play that initial nickel role, to thrive in it, to get more production, more on-the-ball production. And they took him further away from the ball. They put him in a role where it just seemed like it was harder for him to make plays. Then, obviously that regime gets, fired. New regime comes in, Liam Cohen, James Gladstone, Tony Bazzelli, Anthony Campanelli at defensive coordinator. For me, it became pretty clear early on. They signed Jordan Lewis in March. Okay, Savage isn't going to play nickel. Savage, I thought at the time, looked like their starting safety, but a guy who could also play nickel in a pinch if Jordan Lewis wasn't playing it. And it just didn't work out that way. It was a guy who signed a deal in a lame duck year for a previous regime, and then that regime didn't even use him how, more or less, they had originally intended to. So a tough tenure for the guy. I think now that you're looking ahead, there are two questions. One is, what is the long-term outlook at the safety room? Darnell's in his 7th year. It wasn't like, he's a young player who you envisioned starting in 4 years. But he did seem like, at least compared to Murray and maybe even Wingard, was a little bit more of a long-term option in the secondary. Now, they have two very veteran, very experienced starting safeties. And then behind them, health-wise, Caleb Branshaw isn't factoring in anything this year. He's out for the year. So you have third-year Antonio Johnson. You have rookie Rayon Lane, who just seems like a Daniel Thomas type player who's a special teams player and is probably, the last guy that you call off the bench to go in at safety. So to me, now the long-term outlook of the room, they're really pushing some chips in my opinion, on Caleb Branshaw. And it's a leap of faith because you're not going to see him this year. He is out for the season with his foot injury. So in terms of the long-term health and projection of that room, Branshaw is a guy they really need to lean on, and potentially Johnson if he develops. But Branshaw, you don't know what you have in him, and you probably won't until sometime next season. And then to me, the final question is now, who fills that dime safety role? 48 snaps for a third safety over the last 2 games. That's not something you saw the previous regimes. So clearly, Anthony Campanelli sees a value in a third safety. I don't think it was necessarily just because he wanted to get Savage on the field in some capacity. I think that they truly see value in it. Antonio Johnson is the only internal option that makes sense. In terms of external options, they now have an open roster spot. I would imagine they sign a safety or pluck a safety off a practice squad somewhere. Because right now, after Antonio Johnson, like I said, Ray Lane is more of a special teams guy. It is a very thin safety room right now. Thank you guys for listening to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. We'll be back next time.